Some people really don't know when to stay in their place. The words slithered across the cabin like smoke, thick and toxic, dripping from the lips of a man whose expensive suit and smug smile masked a rut that went much deeper. She heard it, of course, standing there at the threshold of first class, her cloth bag clutched tightly, her dark skin already making her the target before a single step had crossed the invisible line they thought they controlled. A stewardess, sensing the shift, moved quickly to intercept her, plastering on a strained smile that failed to hide the disdain pooling in her eyes. "May I help you?" she asked, though the real question hung unspoken in the air. "What are you doing here?" Around them, heads turned and whispers ignited, a silent court already passing judgment, fueled not by facts, but by assumptions as old and poisonous as the ground beneath them. Nobody asked her name. Nobody wondered about her story. They only saw the color she wore and decided she must have made a mistake, an error to be corrected swiftly and publicly. But what they could not see, blinded by their own certainty, was the tidal wave of truth building quietly behind her silence, a reckoning that would crash down before they ever had a chance to brace for impact. This was not simply an encounter. It was the start of a fall none of them would forget. Stay tuned as we peel back the layers of entitlement, expose the cost of quiet cruelty, and reveal how one woman turned humiliation into history. If this opening already has you thinking twice about appearances, like the video, subscribe for more powerful true stories, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and which moment you think will change everything. Grandma Evelyn moved carefully down the polished aisle of the first-class cabin, her simple cloth bag held tightly against her chest. Every step she took echoed softly in the hushed, luxurious space where the leather seats gleamed under the ambient lighting, and the faint scent of expensive cologne floated like an invisible barrier between her and everyone else. Heads barely turned, but eyes darted, and Evelyn felt them like pinpricks along her skin. Marcia, seated neatly in row 1, stole a sharp glance at Evelyn before twisting her face into an expression of mild disgust and quickly looking away. Beside her, Ken shook his head almost imperceptibly, flashing Marcia a smirk laced with contempt, the kind reserved for moments when they believed the natural order had been somehow disturbed. Their silent exchange lingered in the air, more biting than words ever could be. Flight attendant Rebecca, stationed near the entrance to the galley, noticed Evelyn's approach and straightened her posture with a mechanical precision. Folding her arms tightly across her chest, Rebecca wore a smile that lacked any genuine warmth, her gaze cutting through Evelyn like a laser. Rebecca's steps were brisk and deliberate as she closed the distance between them. Her crisp navy uniform seemed to ripple with authority, and her polished shoes clicked purposefully against the flooring. When she stopped in front of Evelyn, she reached for the boarding pass in a motion that was too sharp to be called polite. Evelyn offered it calmly, her weathered hand steady despite the invisible tension thickening the air. Rebecca examined the boarding pass briefly, her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tapping impatiently against the plastic laminate. Without a word, she returned it and pivoted smartly on her heel, her head held high, her expression locked into an icy neutrality that said more than any spoken slight could have. Evelyn clutched her bag a little closer, her heart heavy, but her face remained serene. She had learned long ago that showing reaction was exactly what people like Rebecca craved. Better to give them nothing. Better to be the stone they could not move. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as Evelyn moved toward her assigned seat. Passengers tucked into their champagne flutes and digital tablets pretended not to notice her, but failed miserably at hiding the flicker of disdain, curiosity, or outright amusement in their eyes. A man in one seat coughed loudly, an exaggerated sound that seemed intended to draw attention away from his not-so-subtle side glance. A young woman in 2D flipped her magazine noisily, her nails drumming against the glossy pages as Evelyn passed by. The unspoken message was deafening. "You do not belong here." At her seat, Evelyn paused, her knees aching slightly from the walk. She placed her cloth bag on the seat cushion with a careful touch and began to remove her lightweight coat. As she moved, she was acutely aware of the scrutiny, the whispered judgments clinging to her like a second skin. Rebecca hovered near the galley, her arms crossed tighter now, her body language exuding the stiff, brittle energy of someone who had decided that order needed to be restored. For a moment, Rebecca seemed to hesitate, as if debating whether to step in and correct what she clearly perceived as an anomaly in her perfect first-class kingdom. But Rebecca did not move. Not yet. She watched instead, her gaze a silent reprimand, as if willing Evelyn to falter, to make a mistake that would justify intervention. Evelyn met her stare for a fraction of a second, then calmly reached down and buckled her seatbelt, her movements slow, deliberate, unflinching. The noise of the cabin began to swell again as passengers returned to their distractions, but the atmosphere remained brittle, charged with the knowledge that something unspoken had already begun to unravel. Further down the aisle, Ken leaned closer to Marcia, murmuring something inaudible but unmistakably cruel by the way Marcia's lips curved into a smug grin. Ken chuckled under his breath, a dry, humorless sound that grated against the muted luxury surrounding them. Evelyn adjusted the hem of her dress, smoothed her lap, and sat upright, her back refusing to touch the plush seat behind her. She was a mountain in the storm, weathered and unmoved. The plane's engines hummed to life, a low vibration shivering up through the metal frame. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She had fought through worse storms in her life. She had crossed bridges of prejudice, climbed mountains of assumption, and walked valleys filled with scorn. Today would be no different. She reminded herself that dignity was a weapon, and she wielded it better than anyone who had ever doubted her. A sudden jolt as the jet bridge disconnected caused some passengers to clutch their armrests nervously. Evelyn merely exhaled, her eyes still closed, her face serene. The seatbelt sign blinked above her, a beacon of containment, of order. Rebecca moved briskly down the aisle, making her final checks before takeoff, her professional facade once again firmly in place. As she passed Evelyn's row, Rebecca's eyes lingered one beat too long, her expression tightening with barely concealed annoyance. The hush that had briefly fallen over the cabin was breaking apart, replaced by subtle whispers, stolen glances, and the low hum of judgment sharpening itself into something harder. Rebecca, sensing her moment, moved forward with rigid purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her body cutting through the aisle like a blade. She halted in front of Evelyn's row with a precision that suggested authority but reeked of performance. Standing tall, arms behind her back, Rebecca tilted her chin upward and said in a voice loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to follow me to the back of the cabin." Her words were coded in politeness, but delivered like a slap. Evelyn looked up slowly, her face unreadable, and simply asked, "Is there a problem?" The surrounding passengers, sensing an escalation, shifted in their seats, some feigning disinterest, while others leaned in subtly, eager spectators at the unfolding drama. Rebecca's eyes flicked briefly to the other passengers, ensuring she had an audience before continuing. "First class is reserved for ticketed guests. I need to verify your seat assignment at the rear of the plane." The accusation hung thickly in the air, more accusation than request. Evelyn, still calm, reached into her cloth bag, pulled out her boarding pass, and extended it. Rebecca barely glanced at it before pressing her lips into a thin line and shaking her head. "Please, ma'am, just come with me," she insisted, her tone tight. Todd, a 20-something with tousled blonde hair seated 2 rows back, eagerly pulled out his phone, his eyes lighting up with gleeful anticipation. He angled the camera toward Evelyn, capturing her image as she sat still, framed against the muted gold of the first-class cabin like a portrait of defiance. His fingers danced over the screen, typing rapidly, and within seconds a live stream blinked to life, the caption flashing boldly, "Some people just don't know their place." Evelyn noticed the phone out of the corner of her eye, but chose not to react. She knew too well that dignity demanded silence, even in the face of humiliation. A ripple of quiet laughter traveled through the rows, barely concealed behind hands and champagne flutes. Evelyn tightened her grip on her bag, her knuckles whitening slightly, but her gaze remained steady, never flinching. Ken chuckled audibly now, nudging Marcia, who covered her mouth with her manicured hand. pretending to suppress a giggle. The atmosphere grew heavier, charged with an ugly energy that seemed to crackle just beneath the surface of decorum. Rebecca's voice sharpened. "I won't ask again, ma'am," she said, stepping closer, looming, her shadow falling over Evelyn's lap like a physical weight. Evelyn slowly, deliberately unbuckled her seatbelt, but did not rise. Instead, she met Rebecca's eyes directly and said, "My seat is 2A. It is clearly printed on the boarding pass you hold in your hand." The simple statement, delivered in a voice both calm and unyielding, cut through the low murmur of the cabin like a razor. Rebecca stiffened, aware that the situation was spiraling beyond her control, but too stubborn or too proud to retreat. Behind Rebecca, Todd's phone captured everything, the red dot blinking in the corner of the screen marking each humiliating second. "Come on, lady," someone muttered from row 3, an older man in a designer tracksuit whose expression curled into a sneer. "You're holding up the flight." Rebecca seized on the muttered support like a lifeline. She gestured sharply again. "Either you come with me now, or I will have security escort you." Her voice rose just enough to ensure every person in the cabin could hear, her words designed to brand Evelyn as a troublemaker, a problem, an inconvenience to the seamless luxury that the first-class passengers believed was their birthright. For a moment that stretched painfully long, Evelyn remained seated, the soft hum of the engines the only sound between them. Then, with a grace that defied the tension in the room, she rose, lifting her cloth bag in one hand. Her back was straight, her chin level, her dignity untouched even as the weight of dozens of hostile eyes bore down on her. Todd zoomed in with his camera, capturing the slight tremor in her hand that betrayed her otherwise ironclad composure. Marcia snapped a quick photo on her phone, her lips pursed into a smug smirk. In the first-class cabin, Mr. Whitmore, a silver-haired man with a paunch straining against his monogram sweater, waved impatiently at Rebecca as she returned from her triumph in the back. His wife, Mrs. Whitmore, elegantly draped in a cream cashmere shawl, shot a sharp glance toward where Evelyn had been sitting moments ago, her lips pursed in visible irritation. "Is it sorted?" Mr. Whitmore asked, his voice low but carrying the weight of entitlement. Rebecca offered a tight smile and nodded, but Mrs. Whitmore was not so easily appeased. She reached into her designer handbag and produced her Platinum Elite membership card, flashing it like a badge of superiority as she leaned closer to Rebecca and whispered, "You might want to remember who actually belongs here." Rebecca's smile strained further at the edges as she accepted the unspoken rebuke with a nod, her gaze darting quickly back toward the rear, where Evelyn now sat in stoic silence. Across the aisle, little Lily, a bright-eyed child no more than 7, had wriggled free from her seatbelt and was now kneeling on her seat, peering backward. Her small finger jabbed the air excitedly as she pointed toward Evelyn. "Mommy, look," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "That lady went to the back because she didn't belong up here." Vanessa, her mother, made no effort to correct her. Instead, she gave a light laugh, reaching up to pull Lily gently down into her seat, her face flushed with amusement rather than shame. "Sure, sweetheart," Vanessa murmured, though the smile curving her lips betrayed no true intent to hush her daughter. Around them, a few passengers exchanged smirks, the social permission to belittle now firmly established. Todd, still basking in the afterglow of his viral recording, replayed the footage silently on his phone, his shoulders shaking with barely contained laughter. A man in an expensive business suit sitting across from Todd leaned in slightly, nodding at the screen and chuckling. "Man, they should make her walk to Paris," he muttered under his breath, and Todd snorted in agreement. Meanwhile, Evelyn, though far removed physically from first class, felt every cruel ripple of what was happening as if it were pressed directly against her skin. She did not move. She did not react. She simply sat, spine straight, eyes forward, allowing the full weight of their collective disdain to wash over her without penetrating the fortress of her composure. The plane began its steady ascent into the sky, the engines roaring louder, but the human noise inside the cabin, the whispering, the glances, the muted laughter, remained persistent, ugly, alive. Rebecca, sensing the approval from the Whitmores and other first-class passengers, moved through the cabin with renewed vigor, her every step radiating the smug satisfaction of someone who believed she had restored order. She stopped frequently to offer extra towels, complimentary drinks, and overly bright smiles to the familiar faces, while deliberately bypassing the empty seat where Evelyn once sat, as if its very existence sullied the ambience. Mr. Whitmore sipped his scotch slowly, eyes narrowed, watching the crew with the bored air of a man used to being served without question. "Good help is hard to find," he murmured to his wife, who patted his hand fondly and said, "At least some standards are still being upheld." Vanessa pulled out her phone and typed rapidly, sending a message to her group chat that read, "You will not believe what just happened. Some woman thought she could sit in first. LOL. Lily, still restless, kept trying to peek back toward Evelyn's new seat, her curiosity unquenched. "Is she in trouble, Mommy?" she asked again. Vanessa smiled and said, "She's just learning where she fits, honey. Some lessons are important." Further back in economy, Evelyn shifted slightly, feeling the hardness of the narrower seat against her back. Her hands folded neatly over her bag, she closed her eyes, briefly shutting out the world. Every slight, every whisper, every sneer accumulated inside her like coals banking heat. She was not angry in the way they expected. No, her anger was cold, clear, and patient, forged over a lifetime of navigating spaces that insisted she did not belong. If anything, the events unfolding around her only reaffirmed a truth she had always known, that the higher the wall they built, the more inevitable it became that someone would tear it down. And sometimes, the best revenge was simply waiting until the foundation cracked under its own rotten weight. It was then that Supervisor Clark emerged from the galley, clipboard in hand, moving through the cabin with the false assurance of a man who believed uniforms bestowed unchallengeable authority. His polished shoes thudded against the carpeted floor as he approached Evelyn's row with an expression carefully arranged to project concern, though the tightness of his jaw betrayed his real sentiment. He stopped at the end of the row, flipping through his clipboard with lazy fingers, pretending to verify something but clearly arriving with his mind already made up. Without a word, he shook his head and gave a brisk, dismissive hand gesture, a universal command for stand up and move, delivered as if addressing a disruptive child rather than a paying passenger. Evelyn looked up, locking eyes with him, her face impassive. She made no move to stand, no move to respond, and the silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. Nearby, businessman Paul, who had been nursing a scotch with smug satisfaction, saw the standoff and decided it was his moment to insert himself into the unfolding drama. He rose from his seat with a theatrical sigh, smoothing down the lapels of his tailored suit, and strode toward Evelyn, a folded piece of paper pinched between his fingers like a handkerchief he was reluctant to touch. As he approached, he unfolded the document with a flourish, revealing an economy-class boarding pass freshly printed at the gate. "Here," he said, voice dripping with magnanimity, "this seat is probably more suited to you." His words floated heavily in the air, each syllable laden with condescension. Clark glanced briefly at Paul, the faintest smile twitching at the corner of his mouth, before he quickly rearranged his expression into something resembling professional neutrality. Evelyn remained seated, her face giving away nothing, though the storm behind her eyes was beginning to build. Around them, first-class passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending to look elsewhere, others openly watching, hungry for escalation. Todd, sensing an opportunity for more content, discreetly angled his phone again, starting a fresh recording. Vanessa leaned sideways in her seat, her hand resting lightly on Lily's shoulder as she whispered something that made the child giggle. Mr. Whitmore snorted into his glass of scotch, shaking his head with mock disbelief at the stubbornness of the woman who clearly did not know her place. Paul stepped closer, holding the economy ticket just inches from Evelyn's face, his voice dropping to a mockingly patient tone. "Come on now," he said, "no need to make a scene. It's just a few rows back. I'm sure you'll be much more comfortable there." His smirk deepened, confident that he had cornered her, confident that public humiliation would achieve what authority alone had not. But Evelyn simply blinked slowly, refusing to acknowledge the ticket, the man, or the indignity. After a long beat, she spoke in a voice low and precise. "I have a seat," she said, "and it is not back there." Clark stiffened, feeling the situation slipping further from his grasp. He stepped in again, clearing his throat loudly. "Ma'am, I must insist. This area is reserved for priority guests." His voice, stripped of its earlier pretense of courtesy, now rang with the thinly veiled threat of enforcement. Evelyn did not so much as flinch. Instead, she reached into the side pocket of her cloth bag and slowly, carefully produced her boarding pass, holding it up so that both Clark and Paul could see the unmistakable designation printed in bold. First class, 2A. The moment stretched, painful and undeniable. For a flickering instant, Clark's mask slipped, and naked irritation flashed across his face. Paul's smirk faltered, his hand dropping to his side as if the flimsy economy ticket had suddenly gained the weight of a stone. Around them, the cabin grew unnaturally quiet. Even Todd hesitated, his thumb hovering over the record button, uncertain whether to keep filming or retreat. Mr. Whitmore lowered his glass, his mouth slightly open, and Mrs. Whitmore pressed her hand tighter against his arm. Clark inhaled sharply, the sound ragged in the hush. We will look into it," he said finally, voice tight, already turning away to salvage some shred of authority. Paul muttered something unintelligible and stalked back to his seat, stuffing the economy ticket into his jacket pocket like a discarded insult. Around her, the ripple effects of the confrontation still lingered, an invisible miasma that clung to every whispered conversation, every side glance, every forced chuckle. Rebecca, feeling the sting of her public embarrassment, had retreated to the galley, her composure fraying at the edges. Flight attendant Sarah, younger, fresher, less practiced in the art of cruelty, stood frozen for a moment in the aisle, her tray held stiffly against her chest. Her eyes flickered to Evelyn, guilt and sympathy flashing in their depths, but almost immediately Rebecca caught the movement, snapping her head around with a glare sharp enough to slice through steel. Sarah flinched visibly, dropping her gaze to the floor and scuttling forward with quick, jerky steps, her face burning. In the galley, a small knot of flight attendants had gathered, pretending to sort drinks and meal trays, but in reality drawn together by the same magnetic pull that drew villagers to the scene of a public shaming. Their voices were low, their laughter brittle, as they exchanged rapid whispers punctuated by furtive glances toward the back of the cabin. One attendant, a wiry young man named Kyle, shook his head and said under his breath, "Unbelievable. She just sat there like she owned the place." Another, a woman named Jenna, with too much eyeliner and a brittle smile, snickered and added, "Probably thought no one would call her out." Their words hung in the cramped space, sour and self-satisfied, as if mocking Evelyn somehow reaffirmed their own precarious places in the hierarchy they clung to. Sarah, standing stiffly at the edge of the group, said nothing. Her hands twisted nervously around the edge of her serving tray, and though her face remained neutral, her mind raced. She had seen enough. She had seen the boarding pass, clear as day. She had seen the way Evelyn had carried herself, with the dignity that no title or ticket could confer. And she had seen the ugliness, the raw nakedness of the disdain pouring from her colleagues, from the passengers, from the very structure of the system she had once believed in. For a moment, Sarah thought of stepping forward, of saying something, anything. But the memory of Rebecca's glare held her back like an invisible chain. Back in the main cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. Where once there had been open laughter, now there was a brittle, uneasy energy, as if the passengers sensed that the show had ended, but the repercussions had only just begun. Todd, still fiddling with his phone, rewatched snippets of his earlier recording, the grin on his face faltering as he caught, for the first time, the unflinching stillness of Evelyn's response. She didn't even flinch, he muttered to himself, a note of something dangerously close to respect creeping into his voice. Across the aisle, Vanessa tucked her phone away, her earlier glee fading into an uncomfortable silence as Lily leaned against her, sleepy and restless. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitmore shifted in his seat, the once relished satisfaction of superiority now sitting heavier in his stomach than the scotch he had consumed. "What's the matter with you?" Mrs. Whitmore whispered sharply, noticing his discomfort. He shook his head mutely, unable to articulate the slow creeping realization that perhaps, just perhaps, they had all misjudged the woman they had so eagerly dismissed. At the front of the cabin, Rebecca adjusted her scarf with stiff fingers, her mind racing with calculations and justifications. She convinced herself that order had been preserved, that standards had been upheld, that everything done had been not only necessary, but right. Yet a small voice, one she usually crushed without effort, gnawed at the edges of her certainty. What if the woman in the back wasn't who they thought she was? What if their assumptions, so quickly and gleefully made, were about to unravel in a very public, very humiliating way? Sarah finished distributing her tray of drinks, her hands trembling only slightly now, and retreated once more toward the galley. As she passed Evelyn's row, she dared a quick glance downward. Evelyn sat exactly as before, poised, composed, untouched by the swirling storm. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and Sarah felt a jolt of something profound and unsettling pass between them. It wasn't pity, nor was it sadness. It was recognition. In that glance, Sarah saw not weakness, but a strength so absolute that it shamed her into silence. She hurried on, her cheeks burning. From her seat, Evelyn watched Sarah go, her lips pressing into a line that could have been either sorrow or grim satisfaction. She understood the mechanics of fear and conformity all too well. She did not blame the young ones. Not yet. Their time would come. It always did. Evelyn watched with calm detachment as a young flight attendant, Kevin, hustled down the aisle, arms overloaded with a clipboard, a pile of papers, and several crumpled napkins tucked precariously under one elbow. His nervous energy was a sharp contrast to the manufactured gracefulness of Rebecca and the others. He moved too quickly, turned too sharply, and inevitably the inevitable happened. As he rounded a corner near first class, the papers slipped free from his grasp and fluttered down like oversized snowflakes, scattering across the aisle and skimming under the polished leather seats. Kevin cursed softly under his breath, dropping to his knees to gather the runaway documents, cheeks reddening as several first-class passengers looked on with thinly veiled amusement. Evelyn, still seated with the dignity of a queen misplaced among peasants, tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as one of the papers came to rest at her feet. Without moving from her seat, she leaned down slowly, fingers closing around the errand sheet. It was standard cabin documentation, printed in tidy block letters. But what caught her, I made her heart beat once sharply, before settling into a steady, anticipatory rhythm. It was a passenger list, divided neatly into sections and highlighted prominently in bold font at the top was the heading Priority First-Class Guests. Beneath it, line after line of names appeared, each marked with a discreet checkmark and a handwritten note beside them. VIP, Executive, Board Member. And every single name, without exception, was white. Kevin scrambled over, hand outstretched, face pale. "I'm so sorry," he stammered, reaching for the paper. Evelyn allowed him to take it, offering no resistance, but not before her gaze locked with his for a brief, searing second. She said nothing, but the message in her eyes was clear. "I see." Kevin swallowed hard, scooping up the rest of the papers and retreating as quickly as he could, almost tripping over his own shoes in his haste to disappear back into the galley. Moments later, there was a new ripple through the first-class cabin, a stir of excitement, a collective straightening of spines and brightening of smiles. Melissa, the celebrated VIP passenger, was boarding late. The moment she entered the cabin, a breathless hush fell over the nearby rows, the kind of reverence normally reserved for royalty or movie stars. Melissa wore a tailored cream suit that probably cost more than some people's annual salary, her hair swept up in an immaculate bun, her heels clicking authoritatively as she strode forward. Rebecca appeared almost instantly, materializing from the galley like a conjured servant, her face transformed into a glowing mask of deference. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Whitmore," Rebecca said, her voice silky with manufactured warmth. She actually bent slightly at the waist in a half-bow, a gesture no other passenger had been afforded, not even the Whitmores seated near the front. Melissa nodded graciously but did not smile, allowing Rebecca to fuss over her luggage, adjust her seat, and offer a glass of champagne with the eagerness of a student hoping to impress a strict teacher. Evelyn observed it all from her distant seat, her face expressionless, but her mind coldly cataloging every detail. The other passengers watched too, some with admiration, some with envy, but none with surprise. In their world, this hierarchy was natural, expected, even necessary. One was either among the blessed or among the tolerated. Evelyn knew better. She knew that the foundations of these social structures, so carefully tended and enforced, were rotted through with fear and ignorance, and that a single crack could cause the whole edifice to crumble. Kevin returned to the galley, still rattled, and whispered urgently to Jenna and Kyle. Evelyn could not hear the words, but she saw the way Kyle's eyes darted toward her, the quick shake of Jenna's head, the uncomfortable shifting of feet. Something was happening behind the scenes now, the silent wheels of damage, control, grinding into motion. But it was already too late. The truth, once glimpsed, could not be unseen. Melissa's arrival had provided a temporary distraction, allowing the well-rehearsed rituals of status and privilege to reassert themselves. But in the back of the cabin, Evelyn sat still and patient, her mind sharp and utterly unshaken. She watched the play-acting with a detached interest, a scholar observing the rituals of a dying kingdom. And when the moment felt right, she moved with deliberate slowness, reaching into the deep pocket of her cloth bag to retrieve a slim black phone, its case worn but sturdy. She unlocked the screen with a flick of her thumb, scrolled briefly through her contacts, and pressed a single name. Holding the phone to her ear, she spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the full weight of command. "Activate Protocol 47 Bravo," she said. Now, there was no hesitation on the other end, just a curt acknowledgement before the line went dead. Evelyn slipped the phone back into her bag, sat back, and waited. Less than 2 minutes later, a small red light near the galley blinked to life. It was subtle, easily missed by the distracted or the disinterested, but for those trained to see, it was a beacon. Emergency staff only. The sign pulsed quietly, almost innocently, yet its meaning was anything but benign. Rebecca noticed it first, her eyes narrowing in confusion. She turned toward Clark, who had just emerged from the galley clutching another clipboard, and gestured sharply at the blinking light. "Something's wrong," she hissed under her breath, her carefully constructed poise beginning to unravel. Clark scowled, squinting at the light as if willing it to turn off through sheer authority. But the blinking continued, indifferent to his silent demands. Then, without warning, the forward cabin door opened and a man stepped through, his presence immediately reshaping the atmosphere like a thunderclap. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that somehow managed to look both understated and commanding. His walk was purposeful, his gaze sharp, and as he moved down the aisle, passengers instinctively shrank back against their seats, sensing without understanding that true authority had entered the room. He stopped in the center of the first-class cabin, directly beside Supervisor Clark, and without preamble, reached into his jacket and produced a leather badge holder. Flipping it open, he held it inches from Clark's stunned face. "Federal Aviation Security," he said in a voice that brooked no argument. "My name is Jordan. I am hereby taking control of this cabin for a formal investigation." Clark's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish, no words coming out. Rebecca paled visibly, clutching the service cart for support. Around them, the passengers murmured, the low hum of confusion spreading like ripples across a pond. "There must be some mistake," Clark finally stammered, sweat already beading on his forehead. Jordan's response was swift and cold. "The mistake," he said, "is yours. Please step aside and comply fully. You are now subjects of an active investigation." His tone brooked no disagreement, and after a moment of stunned paralysis, Clark stumbled backward, nodding jerkily. Jordan turned, surveying the cabin with eyes that missed nothing. He made a subtle gesture, and 2 more agents, dressed in plain clothes but unmistakably cut from the same cloth, appeared from the galley and the mid-cabin doors. They began moving methodically through the aisles, checking documentation, matching names to faces. The passengers sat frozen, most too shocked to even reach for their phones. The earlier atmosphere of smug superiority replaced by a raw, primal fear of exposure. Jordan moved smoothly, professionally. But when his gaze swept across the rows and settled briefly on Evelyn seated in economy, he gave a barely perceptible nod of respect, one professional acknowledging another. Rebecca tried once more to assert control, stepping forward with her clipboard raised like a shield. "We have very important guests on board," she began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Your disturbing first-class service." Jordan fixed her with a stare so cold it could have frozen fire. "You disturbed first-class service the moment you decided to override federal anti-discrimination protocols," he said. "Now sit down and remain silent unless addressed." Without a word, he inclined his head in a gesture of deep respect, a silent acknowledgement of her true standing. Passengers craned their necks, eyes wide with confusion and dawning fear, as Evelyn slowly rose from her seat, her cloth bag still tucked neatly under her arm. She did not rush, did not boast, did not gloat. She simply stood, every line of her body radiating a quiet authority that made even the most privileged passengers shrink slightly in their seats. Jordan extended his hand, not in command, but in invitation. "Madam, if you would please join me," he said, his voice low and formal, carrying easily through the stunned silence. Evelyn gave a single nod and moved forward, her steps measured, unhurried. Every eye followed her progress, their earlier disdain curdling into a potent mixture of shame, disbelief, and a creeping, terrified understanding. As she passed through the aisle, whispers rose and then died quickly, smothered by the suffocating awareness that something monumental had just been set into motion. At the front of the cabin, Jordan reached for a hidden panel beside the service galley, tapping a code into the keypad. Instantly, the main in-flight entertainment screen, previously looping scenic images of Paris, went black. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as the logo of the United States Human Rights Commission blazed across the screen in stark white letters against a navy blue background. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then the footage began to play. The video, captured by the plane's internal security system, left no room for interpretation. There was Rebecca confronting Evelyn with barely disguised contempt. There was Clark dismissing her legitimate boarding pass with a wave of his clipboard. There was Paul brandishing an economy ticket like a weapon. There were the passengers laughing, whispering, mocking. Every moment, every slight, every betrayal captured in high definition, their faces frozen forever in a tableau of prejudice and casual cruelty. Someone gasped audibly when their own image appeared on the screen. Todd dropped his phone in his lap, his earlier confidence shattered. Mr. Whitmore turned a sickly shade of gray, sinking lower into his seat. Mrs. Whitmore clutched at her pearls reflexively, as if they could protect her from the damning truth playing out in front of her. Vanessa pulled Lily into her lap and turned the child's face away from the screen, but it was too late. The reality had already imprinted itself. Rebecca, frozen in the jump seat near the galley, stared at the screen as if willing it to shut off. Her hands twisted in her lap, nails biting into the soft flesh of her palms. Clark stood stiffly to one side, his face an immobile mask, though the slight tremble in his shoulders betrayed the panic taking hold. Jordan stood silently at the front, allowing the images to speak for themselves. No accusations were necessary. The evidence was irrefutable. The video ended not with a fade to black, but with a series of still images. Evelyn's boarding pass clearly marked first class 2A, the priority list showing no minorities among the VIPs, and finally a close-up shot of Evelyn sitting alone, dignified and poised, while the cabin around her buzzed with disdain. The screen then shifted to a simple message. Investigation initiated, federal oversight engaged. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence, so profound it seemed to press against the eardrums. Then Jordan spoke, his voice calm, but carrying the unshakable authority of law. "The events you have witnessed were captured in real time by federal monitors as part of an ongoing compliance audit," he said. "Failure to adhere to anti-discrimination laws carries significant penalties, including revocation of licenses and loss of federal funding." His gaze swept the cabin, impassive, clinical. All involved parties are being documented for further action. The words fell like hammer blows. Paul visibly sagged in his seat, running a shaking hand through his hair. Rebecca lowered her head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Clark leaned against the galley wall for support, his clipboard slipping from numb fingers and clattering loudly against the floor. Evelyn stood quietly beside Jordan, her presence anchoring the chaotic energy of the cabin. She had not needed to raise her voice, to plead, to demand justice. Her mere existence, her refusal to bow, had been enough. She turned slightly, surveying the faces that had so recently judged and condemned her, now laid bare in their fear and guilt. She saw no satisfaction in their downfall, only inevitability. Melissa, the newly arrived VIP, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier confidence crumbling as she realized her proximity to scandal could stain even her pristine reputation. She averted her eyes, but Evelyn noticed and filed the moment away with all the others. Evelyn remained standing at the front of the cabin, her presence an immovable fact that none dared challenge, while Jordan and his team coordinated quietly over secure communication devices, preparing for what was to come. As the wheels touched down on the runway with a jarring thud, the collective breath inside the cabin seemed to catch, as though everyone had realized at once that the flight might be ending, but the reckoning was just beginning. The captain's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, noticeably stiffer than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington Dulles International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we arrive at the gate." His tone lacked the usual cheerful cadence, replaced by a flatness that betrayed his awareness of the scene unfolding behind him. Through the small oval windows, figures in dark suits could already be seen assembling on the tarmac, the bright flashes of camera crews setting up their equipment glittering against the early afternoon sun. As the plane taxied toward the designated gate, Jordan moved swiftly down the aisle, giving final instructions to his agents. "No sudden movements," he said quietly. "Escorts will be provided for designated individuals. Follow standard extraction protocol." His professionalism was unshakable, his commands efficient, but even he could sense the electric charge snapping in the air, the collective dread that had thickened into something almost tangible. When the aircraft door finally swung open, the boarding bridge locked into place with a heavy metallic clang, and immediately, the cabin was flooded with activity. Federal officers boarded first, moving with military precision, their expressions neutral, but their purpose unmistakable. They fanned out through the cabin, calling names with clipped authority. "Martin Lewis," one barked. "Step forward immediately." From the first-class section, a man in his late 50s, wearing an immaculate navy suit, stood shakily, his face ashen. Martin Lewis, CEO of the Airline, the man whose policies had allowed the systemic rot to fester, was escorted down the aisle in full view of every passenger, his head bowed, but his expression stubbornly blank. Behind him, Rebecca was called next. Her legs trembled, so violently she almost stumbled as she rose from the jump seat, clutching the wall for support. Todd, once smug with his camera, now looked like a boy caught stealing, his face pale and sweaty as an agent approached him with quiet, firm instructions. Mr. Whitmore attempted to argue, his voice rising in panic. "This is outrageous," he barked. "I have rights. I demand to speak to someone in charge." The agent facing him remained stone-faced. "Sir, you are free to contest any actions taken today through proper legal channels. For now, you will comply." The passengers who had remained silent witnesses to Evelyn's humiliation now watched the reverse spectacle unfold. The powerful stripped of their illusions, the entitled led away like school children caught cheating on an exam. Cameras outside the aircraft captured every moment. Networks had been alerted during the flight's final descent, and now reporters jostled for position beyond the secure perimeter, shouting questions and broadcasting live updates. "Breaking news from Dulles Airport," one reporter announced breathlessly. Sources confirmed that multiple airline officials and first-class passengers are under federal investigation following allegations of racial discrimination and civil rights violations. Inside the terminal, screens lit up with breaking alerts. Government spokespeople confirmed that immediate action was being taken, including the suspension of all federal contracts with the airline and the initiation of a full civil rights probe. Jordan turned to Evelyn, his voice pitched low but firm. "Ms. Carter, if you would like, we have arranged a private exit for you to avoid the media." Evelyn considered the offer for a heartbeat before shaking her head. "No," she said softly. "Let them see." She stepped forward, walking with quiet dignity down the aisle once more, but this time there were no sneers, no laughter, no whispered mockery. Only silence, thick and absolute. As she exited the aircraft, the flashbulbs exploded in bursts of white light, but Evelyn did not flinch. She lifted her chin, her face calm and unbowed. Reporters shouted questions. "Ma'am, did you plan this operation? Ma'am, how do you feel about the arrests?" Evelyn paused briefly on the jet bridge, her figure silhouetted against the harsh sunlight, and then continued walking, steady, unstoppable. The days that followed were a blur of headlines, investigations, public outrage, and swift corporate collapse. Skytower Airlines, once the darling of the aviation industry, crumbled beneath the weight of its exposed corruption. Executives resigned in disgrace, investors fled like rats from a sinking ship, and the public demanded accountability at every level. Yet, amid the fury and the noise, another quieter transformation began to take shape, one rooted not in vengeance, but in reckoning. Inside a modest conference room in a nondescript government building, Rebecca sat before a stark, unadorned camera. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting her pale face in an unforgiving light. Her once meticulously styled hair hung limp around her face, her uniform long since surrendered along with her position. She twisted her hands together on the table, knuckles white, her breathing shallow. The agent operating the camera gave a small nod, signaling that the recording had begun. Rebecca swallowed hard, lifted her gaze, and spoke in a trembling voice. "My name is Rebecca Simmons. I was a flight attendant with Skytower Airlines. I made mistakes. I allowed prejudice to dictate my actions. I failed to uphold the dignity and humanity of every passenger entrusted to my care. I am deeply sorry." Her voice cracked on the last words, and tears slid unchecked down her cheeks as she lowered her head in shame. The footage was not mandated by any court. It was something else, something more personal. A choice. A beginning. Elsewhere, Todd recorded a similar statement, his youthful arrogance stripped away, replaced by a hollow remorse. "I thought it was funny," he said, staring bleakly into the lens. "I thought it didn't matter. But it did. It mattered more than I realized. And I'm sorry." His words fell into the silence, like stones dropped into deep water, heavy and sinking. Clark followed next, his voice thin but earnest as he acknowledged his failures, his complicity. "There is no excuse for what I allowed to happen under my watch," he said. "I thought following procedure was enough. It wasn't. It never is." These videos were not widely broadcast. They circulated quietly among the circles that needed to see them most: regulatory boards, diversity training programs, internal reform committees. They were used not as punishments, but as lessons, markers of what must never be allowed to happen again. A year passed. The airline, under entirely new leadership, rebranded and rebuilt from the ground up, implemented the most rigorous anti-discrimination protocols in the industry. Flights now carried mandatory human rights briefings alongside safety demonstrations. Training programs included emotional intelligence workshops, empathy seminars, history courses on civil rights movements. It was not perfect. It would never erase the past. But it was a start. On a warm spring afternoon, in a newly inaugurated Aviation Equity Symposium held at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Sarah stood nervously backstage, clutching a thin sheaf of notes in one hand. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back neatly, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage, blinking against the bright lights, and approached the podium. The audience, a gathering of industry leaders, activists, government officials, and survivors of discrimination, fell silent. Sarah took a deep breath, looked out over the sea of faces, and began. 1 year ago, she said, I watched a woman stand against an entire system. She didn't shout. She didn't fight. She simply stood. And in doing so, she showed me what courage really looks like. She paused, steadying her voice. That day changed my life. It taught me that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. That small actions, like averted gazes and unspoken doubts, build the foundation for great wrongs. And it showed me that change begins when we refuse to be silent. The room remained hushed, every ear straining to catch her words. Today, I work to ensure that what happened to her will never happen again. Not on my watch. Not on anyone's watch. Sarah stepped down to warm applause, tears pricking her eyes. As she returned to her seat, she caught sight of a familiar figure sitting quietly in the back row. Evelyn sat there, composed as ever, a faint smile curving her lips, her eyes shining with pride and something deeper, hope. The two women exchanged a nod, a silent promise passing between them. The work was not finished. It would never truly be finished. But the foundation had been laid anew, not with stone or steel, but with the courage of one woman who refused to be diminished. Outside, the city thrummed with life, indifferent and relentless. But inside that hall, for one shining moment, justice had found a voice, and it would not be silenced again. The end. If you found this story powerful and thought-provoking, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more real stories that matter. We would love to hear from you. Which part of Evelyn's journey stood out to you the most? Was there a moment that made you stop and think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, tell us where you are watching from. It is amazing to see how far stories like this can travel and inspire change. Your voice matters. Join the conversation below.